Good evening, and thank you to these hearty souls coming out on a night like this. I'm Heather Campion, CEO of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, along with my colleague Tom Putnam, who's the director of the Kennedy Library, to this evening's forum. This is one of only 13 presidential libraries in America, the place where we like to say President Kennedy's legacy comes alive. It's a true national treasure, and I hope you'll come back to visit our museum and be inspired by President Kennedy's words and all that was accomplished in his administration. These forums are free and open to the public, both in this room and on the Kennedy Library's website, as they're now all being live streamed, so there's a much larger audience than the one we see here today. And it's thanks to the generous support from our leading sponsor, Bank of America, as well as the Boston Foundation, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, and Viacom. We also have media partners that help expand the reach of our audiences, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Tonight, it's my very special privilege to welcome two distinguished Americans to our forum. Our moderator is the very talented news correspondent, Deborah Becker, whose voice many of you will recognize from her work as senior correspondent and host at our local NPR station, WBUR. Deborah's reporting focuses on mental health, criminal justice, and education, and she has won numerous awards from groups such as the Radio Television Digital News Association, the Associated Press, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Before joining WBUR in 1998, Deborah worked at the Christian Science Monitor's Monitor Radio and helped also to launch Rhode Island's NPR news station, WRNI, where she served there as the host of Morning Edition and the weekly show, Focus Rhode Island. So thank you for joining us, Deborah. And we are especially pleased to have as our speaker this evening the chairman of the Special Olympics and President Kennedy's nephew, Dr. Timothy Shriver. He is no stranger to this magnificent building or to President Kennedy's life and legacy. Tim has continued the Kennedy family tradition of service in politics, but politics, as he calls it, with a small p. That is, the engagement in political and social organizations that exist to advance the public good, and he has certainly done that. Tim's dedication to public service is quite literally in his DNA. He's the child of two of our country's most remarkable forces for public good. His mother, President Kennedy's sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, conceived of and founded the Special Olympics, growing it and championing it throughout her life. His father, Sargent Shriver, was the first director of the Peace Corps in America. And I was just saying, in today's world, it's quite remarkable when one realizes that Sargent Shriver launched this organization and sent over 500 Peace Corps volunteers to 9 different countries, all within 10 months of President Kennedy taking office. Tim was also greatly influenced by his relationship with his aunt, Rosemary Kennedy, who was born with intellectual disabilities and for whom he is described as, and I quote, "perhaps the most extraordinary of my mother's siblings." After receiving his Ph.D. in education and spending 15 years as a public school teacher and counselor, Tim joined Special Olympics in an official capacity. In the last 20 years, he's guided the organization through an incredibly ambitious growth agenda and recruited millions of new athletes to participate worldwide. He's also created new programs such as Special Olympics Healthy Athletes, which has become the world's largest public health examination and education program for those with intellectual disabilities. It's fitting that he's here in this building, memorializing President Kennedy, to discuss his new memoir entitled Fully Alive, Discovering What Matters Most, copies of which are on sale here in our museum store, and Tim will be signing copies afterwards for anyone who would like an autographed version. Not only because of his family relation, but because this topic of intellectual disability was one quite near and dear to President Kennedy's heart as well. Before the Kennedy administration, there had been little research on human development and mental disabilities. However, even before President Kennedy took the oath of office, he formed a task force solely focused on the issue, and once in office, he established the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to bring this previously ignored field to the forefront. He fought on behalf of this issue throughout his years in office, and in October of 1963, he signed 2 pieces of legislation to combat intellectual disability. And I just wanted to read you one of his quotes on this topic. Today, as he signed the legislation, he said, "Under present conditions of scientific achievement, it will be possible for a nation as rich in human and material resources as ours to make the remote reaches of the mind accessible. The mentally ill, and as we would say today, the intellectually challenged, need no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities." Throughout his life and career, Timothy Shriver has taught us how to embrace and learn from this inspiring community, and we are honored to have him here tonight carrying on President Kennedy, Eunice Shriver, and Sargent Shriver's legacy. Thank you.
Deborah, very much. Thanks very much.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
welcome to all of you, especially coming out in this weather. It's unbelievable getting here. Yeah, we need to applaud you for coming today.
Absolutely.
It was terrible out there, but Tim, I have to say that I really enjoyed the book. I found it to be, part story of the Special Olympics, part story of the Kennedy family, but really a lot of your personal story, a lot of philosophy, and a lot of your quest for meaning in life, which is something all of us look for. And I think I'd like to start by talking about the history, because it really gives us the backdrop of what it was like at the time, early in the 20th century, when we found out really, how the world was, from your book we found this out, how the book, or how the world and the US in particular, treated people with intellectual disabilities. Why don't you remind us of some of that history so we know the backdrop?
Sure. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for asking me to start with the book, and thank you all for coming. Thanks, Special Olympics Massachusetts, for bringing a good crowd. The stalwart, I know, thumbs up to Special Olympics Massachusetts. There would have been thousands here if it had been a sunny day. We know that. But listen, look at you, look to your left and right. You see a hardy person, a gutsy person, a brave person, and a generous person. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming. So many friends in the audience, Dr. Gary Sipperstein and Mary Beth and her whole team. Joanne Simons, who is a former member of our board, and Andrew Kesson, a longtime friend. So many, many friends in the audience, and I'm very grateful to you all. Susan Senator, a great writer, for coming tonight. Where this story starts, in some ways, is at the beginning of time. I think in some ways, when we look at difference, we look down, we look with fear, we look with trepidation. In the United States, you could look at the long history of the treatment of people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, mental illness, anybody that didn't fit in the culture. And we find really quite tragic, quite painful stories throughout history. Surprisingly, as the Enlightenment comes, this period of time we think of when reason finally triumphs over myth and magic, when the mind begins to conquer the wind and the waves, and we start to have scientific explanations for things. It is right at the cusp of that scientific ascendancy that people with intellectual differences get treated the worst. It is the beginning in the late 19th century and early 20th century of large-scale institutionalization. At the time of my Aunt Rosemary, at the time of her birth, a popular film was called The Black Stork, which depicted scientists arguing and championing the role of mothers who would allow their newborn infants to die if they were diagnosed with a disability. And this film was all the rage, a film that captured the public's attention. Just a few years after the birth of my Aunt Rosemary Kennedy, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a famous Supreme Court justice, penned a decision authorizing the sterilization against people's will on the grounds that institutions and people with intellectual disabilities that were in them were bad seed, were cursed, were a threat to the culture, a threat to the country, and as he writes in that famous decision, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. It is time that they be sterilized. And so this is the period in which the president's family emerges. The president himself, born in this window, his sister Rosemary, my mother Eunice a few years later, and 9 children in Boston, born into a large Irish Catholic family where we don't know this, but we have to assume that doctors or social workers would have said to my grandmother, it's time that you give up Rosemary. She will be cared for somewhere else, better to let her go. Mothers were told that a child with an intellectual disability would compromise their mothering, that they themselves would become poor mothers, and so on and so forth. So it's almost too painful to mention in some regards because it's so recent. And because as we sit in a room like this with the whole diversity of human experience in it, we speak to one another about these things. We are all a part of this history. But my grandmother and my grandfather chose to keep Rosemary at home with, as I can hear, I can hear this because I can hear the echoes in my own life of their voices saying to each child, to Joe and to Jack and to Eunice and to Kathleen and to all the children on down, you take care of your sister. You include your sister. You make sure your sister's involved. You make sure she's included. If you go out sailing now, you make sure you don't leave your sister behind. I can hear that. I didn't hear it literally, but I can hear that voice of my grandmother, and I can hear the echo in my mother's voice, which I write about a little bit in the book, where she would see her own mother. This was, I almost think of it almost like post-traumatic stress. She would say all the way until she really, almost to the end of her life, she would say, I can remember my mother picking up the phone and calling and asking, does anybody know? Does anybody have ideas for how to help Rosemary? And then she'd put down the phone, her mother would, and she'd turn to my mother and say, there's nothing, nothing, nothing. And that word echoed back into my mother's mind, nothing, nothing, nothing.
Which really was, an impetus for your mom to start what became the Special Olympics, which is amazing, in the early 60s, in your backyard.
Yeah, in our backyard, with enormous, many other families were activists in this time, the National Association, we used to be called of Retarded Citizens, now the ARC, many activists who were interested. And during the Kennedy administration, she and the president chose to finally reveal publicly that they had a sibling. If you look at many of the pictures here, it's not surprising even today that most of the pictures here, when you look at the Kennedy family, will not include Rosemary. Even today. No malice, no negative intent. But it's as though you see the night when the president was elected and people gathered in Hyannisport, and you see the picture of all the president's brothers and sisters and husbands and wives and the parents, except one. Except one. So, this desire, this willingness to break this code, it's hard for us to imagine today how difficult it was to break the stigma. But around the world, let's be honest, this vulnerability exists still. Steve Perlman has traveled with us all over the world to try to look at the issues around medical care and pioneer changes. But, it's a big uphill battle. So this issue of shame and stigma, fear of difference, fear of vulnerability remains so much a part of our culture. And yet, as you point out, into that comes this sort of quirky, almost eccentric innovation, which is, well, to heck with all of you, let's go swimming. Let's go for a pony ride. Let's play kickball. Let's have a ropes course. Now, I have to say, I don't say this just because she's my mother, but that is the last intervention I would have thought of to change the country. If you went to the Kennedy School at Harvard and said, we want to change public policy, we want to open up the gates of freedom to a neglected minority, we want to close terrible institutions that are warehousing people with the most horrific conditions, I don't think If you'd gone to every university in the country, anybody would have said, let's try kickball.
But she did, and you remember that. You remember that as a child.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I remember this great combination, which is I look out my window and here comes 100 people. I didn't know where they were coming from. I didn't know the backstory.
Do you remember what you were thinking at the time?
You know, I remember being puzzled more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could see that my mother, I mean, you know, this starts when I'm 4 years old, so I don't, you know, you just see pictures when you're a child, right? I mean, what can you remember when you're 5? You remember a snapshot, you remember a voice, you know, an image. I remember my mother, and, you know, anybody that remember, a lot of people here knew my mother. I mean, it was intense. She was focused. This was not summer fun for her. She had a mission. But I also remember that, you know, all of a sudden my backyard has got everybody you'd want to play with. I mean, it's so much fun. You know, and ponies arrive at your backyard. You're 5 years old. It's like, what's not to like about this, you know? And so I like to say that most of life, if someone tells you you're going to do something important, you can be pretty sure it's not going to be fun. And if someone says, let's do something fun, it's not going to be important. It's going to be fun, but not important. In my backyard, fun and important were together. And I think the genius of how to change, not so much political systems, but how to change hearts and minds, is to make the change inviting enough that it is fun. And I use fun. I don't mean joyful. Joyful's so beautiful and all that. But this was fun. And at the same time, help people to see that by doing something fun, they can do something really important. I say sometimes, for instance, you know, if you're 12 years old and you go to a middle school that has children with special needs in it, and there's a child with Down syndrome in that school, and you're 12, and you are the only person who has the power to make that child feel included. Teachers can't do it. Principals can't do it, security guards can't do it, bus drivers can't do it, parents can't do it. Only a 12-year-old can do that. So that 12-year-old has enormous power to do something really important in life, even if it's just to put a cheeseburger next to someone else who's having a cheeseburger and say, how's your day? So, I mean, that's maybe not as fun as Camp Shriver was for me, but there are so many ways in which if we could find the language to talk about changing the world with a smile on our faces, I think we'd attract a lot more people than we sometimes do to the causes we care about.
Now, it's amazing to think that how quickly it happened. We're talking the early 60s. It was camp in your backyard,
right.
And now it's a massive international organization known as the Special Olympics. That's a really short period of time, and to a large degree, I would think, because of how the message of the Special Olympics resonates with people.
Yeah.
How do you articulate that message, and why do you think it resonates with
Well, I spent 250 pages
Well, I know. That's why
trying to
I want
articulate
you to tell
it,
everybody.
and obviously I didn't get it quite down to a sentence or a soundbite. It's interesting because there's a lot of Special Olympics people here. If you were to ask that question of all the people in the room, you'd probably get 100 different answers. The idea, but you're right. If you go to China, if you go to India, if you go to Malawi, if you go to Peru, if you go to Mexico, France, or Germany, and you go to a Special Olympics event, you will find it swarming with volunteers of every different geography, culture, political persuasion, religion. I was in Syria a few years ago with tens of thousands of people helping in Damascus, volunteering nationwide to help create big games there. And you could say the same thing in Cuba, you could say the same thing in China, you could say the same thing. I was in Malawi just a little while ago, one of the poorest countries on earth, and yet the volunteers are there. I think, in the end, I think the conclusion of this book, to me, is that when we cross a line of misunderstanding and fear with, and make a connection, a relationship with someone who, at some level, scares us, and heal the fear, we get back ourselves so much less afraid, so much more joyful, so much more able to fulfill our own distinct missions. And so I think so many people in this room came maybe once, 5, 7, 10, 12, 14 years ago. Maybe you're a mom or a dad and you chanced upon this community in an unlikely way. But you probably had some moment at which you said, wow, this is more fun than I can have just about anywhere else. And I like me here more than I like me elsewhere. I'm a better me here. I'm more free. I feel less judged. I feel less encumbered. I feel validated by other people. I feel accepted. Now, the idea that a person with Down syndrome, who has been, most of whom have such a tough time, or autism, have such a tough time finding a place of acceptance, the idea that they are the agents of the, if you will, the freeing of the rest of us, if there is a them and an us, which I don't even like the language, I think there's only us. I think that's what you learn at Special Olympics. There's only us.
And is that why you think it resonates with everybody across the board, and why it's been able to gather support so quickly?
Well, I think you know, my premise is that there's a deep spiritual hunger that each of us has to be free of fear. And I think, in a way, to be free of the fear of judgment of others is the greatest freedom you can have. Because if you're no longer afraid of being judged, you actually get to be whoever you think. If you know who you're supposed to be, if you've done the work to sort of dig down and say, this is my mission, I'm no longer afraid of anyone's judgment, I'm going to do this, I think that's the first satisfaction that comes from being around our movement. I think the second is that it's really joyful. And most people struggle in life to find happiness, let's be honest. Most people struggle in life to find places where people are generally happy and smile. And you know, I tell a story in here about being on the set of the Farrelly Brothers movie, and I asked one of the actors, he said to me, you know, this is the best set I've ever been on, I'm getting back so much more than I give. And I said, well, what do you get back? He said, I don't know, I get back, we have a good time. And I'm like persistent and irritating. So I said, well, no, you said you got something back. And he was like looking at me like, you know, you're really annoying. And he said, look, I don't know what to tell you. This set has 50 Special Olympics athletes on it, and I get 20 hugs a day. And I like it. That's what I get back. There's not many places we go, any of us, where, you know, we just sort of all of a sudden feel like it's okay to just say hi with a hug. It's a little awkward if you're not into the movement, you know. Some of us, I do this sometimes, and people are like, ooh, creep. But there's a kind of a hug that the Special Olympics movement invites that's so authentic and so raw and so joyful that I think people can't find elsewhere.
Can you tell us a little bit about the story that you tell in the book of Loretta Claiborne? Because she's a big part of the book. Can you relay that to me?
Loretta, how many people know Loretta? Because I don't want, see, everybody knows Loretta. She's like Michael Jordan in our movement, you know. It's like, oh, I know that story already. I've seen her do that flying jump shot. But the truth is that one of the reasons I think she appeals so broadly in our movement is not, I mean, she has the basic narrative, which is she had nothing. African-American woman, poor, housing projects, diagnosed as retarded, partially blind, and unable to walk. I mean, it's hard to imagine in York, Pennsylvania, starting out there for anybody. Schools didn't want her. She drove. I mean, I don't tell the story in detail in the book, but she was driven with her mother to the institution, Eastern State. 6,000 people were housed there at the time. And when she got there, she remembers saying, I want to stay. She wanted to get out of where she was so bad. It was so painful. She was beaten up. I mean, it was just, so she gets to an institution as a little girl in her little, I think it was a pink dress, all dressed up with a suitcase. And she wanted to stay. Just get me out of the life that I'm in. Her mother knew better, took her home. The social workers complained, Rita, this is ridiculous. We've done all this work. We got the placement. We got the, you know, this is where she belongs. But her mom kept her home. And she struggles mightily until someone sees that she has one thing she loves, right? And so everybody has one thing they love. And if somebody finds you and says to you, I know what you love, Susan, I know what you love, you're going to do it. I'm going to give you a place where you're going to do it. And she resisted, but she gets there and she describes this moment as, and think of your own moment, because everybody has a moment like this, I'm convinced, where she ran on that track for the first time. I can't remember exactly, maybe 17, 18 years old. And people cheered for her. And she looked around and she's like, wow, yeah, they're clapping for me. I just ran and they're clapping for me. And she knew right then and there that that's the place she wanted to live. And she wanted to bring the world to her. So I meet Loretta later on, and I have this backwards view of the Special Olympics movement. I have it all, in effect, all wrong. I mean, I grew up around it, all that stuff, but I still had it all wrong. Because I thought to myself, what we're trying to do in this movement is prove that our athletes, our people, that they can fit in. They're just like everyone else. I can show you. I've got athletes who can run as fast as you can, or kick the soccer ball better than you can, or dribble with their left hand, Deborah, better than you. I can prove it. Come watch them. They're going to fit into your world. And Loretta, we invited her to speak to the Yale Alumni Association in New Haven. And I'm thinking, this is the people we want to convince. They're smart, they're rich, they're successful, they got these big degrees, they got access to power. Loretta, give a talk that will prove to them that you can live in their world. And she gets up and says, you all live in this great university, and you guys have degrees, but you should come to our world. And I'm like, where's she going? It's like, it's the wrong message. And she described going to the games in 1991, and she was afraid when she went to the games in 1991 that the Russian athletes would come and not feel welcome. Because at the time, the Soviet Union and the United States were enemies or opponents or whatever you want to call it. So she got tapes of Russian instruction, and she learns Russian just so she can go find the Russian delegation and tell them you're welcome here.
That's great.
Now, here's a person with an intellectual all these labels, none of them capture anything close to who she is. And she's telling the Yale alumni, in our world, if you come from a different place, we learn the language to make you feel welcome. In our world, winning isn't about beating other people. It's about doing your best. In our world, everybody gets a chance, no matter where you start. In our world, if you want to volunteer, we welcome you to give your best. And they're all these guys, I hate to say it, old men. At the time, it was mostly, I think it was almost all men. And I could see them, I have to be honest, I don't think they got it. But as I listened, I thought to myself, this is a woman who understands the world she wants to live in, and she's willing to work to create it. Most of us look at the world out there that we have to fit into, and we try to mold ourselves to fit into it. And in so many ways, it's exactly the wrong thing to do. And as I listened to her, I thought, I have a lot to learn from this woman. And that's continued. That's uninterrupted.
And at the same token, you tell the story in the book of Nelson Mandela and how he dedicated his 84th birthday party to the Special Olympics.
To the Special Olympics. He was an extraordinary friend of the movement in ways I couldn't quite understand, to be honest. He came to Ireland. If any of you were there in 2003, you saw him introduced by Bono on stage with 75,000 people, and he came out, and Bono says, the quote is, I'm introducing the president of everyone who wants to be free. And Mandela comes out, and he gives his speech, and you, the athletes of Special Olympics, inspire us. And then we get another call where he wants to do more. I'm thinking to myself, okay, you know. I thought we'd gotten everything we could possibly get from this man, and he dedicated his birthday, and I got lucky enough to be invited back to his home with my mother and a couple of colleagues afterwards, and I, like anybody, I was sort of a hero worshiper around him, almost in an embarrassing way. You see Nelson Mandela without almost feeling, oh my God, at least I did. Here's a man, again, talk about adversity, 27 years in a cell half the size of this riser, hard labor, lost his hearing, lost his knees, a letter a year or something like that, 2 books a year, didn't know his wife, didn't meet his children, didn't see them marry. I mean, if there was a man who deserved to be bitter, angry, it was him. And if you've seen him, well, everybody's seen the pictures. Every picture, he's got a smile the size of this backdrop. Right. And I thought to myself, how do you do that? I mean, I just thinking to myself, I just would be really a different person if I'd gone through that, I think. So I asked him, I'm like all nervous. I said, how do you ask that question? I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I don't know how to ask this question. I'm already talking. My mouth is moving, but I don't know what words to put in, like, how do you, I said, how do you become like you, or something like that. Something terrible. He looks at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you're like, you've got this big smile, and you've got so much joy in you, and and he says, well, there's, all of us in prison, he says, all of us in prison learn the same lesson. We learned humility, and we learned simplicity. Humility, we learned the struggle wasn't about us. We were just a part. And simplicity, you can be happy with almost nothing. And he said those are the same lessons that the athletes are trying to teach. Humility, the struggle is big, and we're all just a part. And simplicity, look at them. He says, you don't need me to he didn't say it this way. He says, sorry, this phone, I forgot to turn it off. You don't need me to teach you. You have the athletes here ready to teach. And if you think about politics, and you think about the icons of politics, I think if we looked at political leaders and measured them by their humility and by their simplicity, if that were the question tough reporters asked and challenged people to respond to, I think we'd have the kinds of political leaders that the country, or any country, needs, especially now, because we live in an empowered age. People don't want to be told what to do. They want people who see larger struggle and invite populations, Republicans, Democrats, all kinds of colors and races and religions, into a much bigger sense of what's important. And I think, unfortunately, the political parties have found themselves too much in positions where they get paid, if you will, they get their benefits, their power from being divisive, and that's, I think, a great tragedy that a guy like Mandela saw through. I mean, who would have blamed him, sorry for the long answer, but last point, who would have blamed him for coming out of prison after 27 years and creating an all-African, all-black government and telling the whites, thank you very much. The second day out of prison, he's having lunch with the guy who put him in jail. I mean, it's still amazing, right? I mean, you can hear the story 1,000 times, and it's still amazing.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about your story and how we know you played in your backyard.
I prefer not to.
But really, it's an interesting story, and I think it's a great lesson for a lot of people. But after you were playing in your backyard in the 60s, and you were trying to get a handle on exactly what was happening here, you first started working with at-risk youth in your professional life, for lack of a better term, at-risk teenagers in New Haven. And you learned a lot from them, and it almost seemed like it made sense that you did that first and took those lessons into then leading the Special Olympics. Why don't you tell everyone, I'm sure there are a lot of people here who know, but just briefly how that came about.
Hopefully they don't know this, but well, I think that, I spent about 14 years in the New Haven public school system. I ended up working quite a lot in special education, but my primary training was in risk and resilience, in high-risk kids and in the prevention of behavior, academic, or social problems. So what can you do to reduce the risk that kids will drop out, reduce the risk that kids will use drugs or get involved in unwanted pregnancies or become violent or become incarcerated or all these issues. So I spent a lot of time with these kids, and again, I have to say, you'll think I'm kind of not the kind of guy you want to read a book written by, but I had it all wrong. I felt like my mission, I grew up in this family, and my dad was a social change guy, and my mom was a social change pioneer, and my uncles were big political leaders, and I thought, I gotta fix these kids. I gotta show that we can prove that these kids can perform. Same, you can see the pattern. And the kids really, these young 12, 14, 16-year-olds, they just could see me coming, and they were like, There was a real disdain. And I wasn't a bad guy. I was earnest. I worked 80 hours a week. I went into the housing projects. I worked all weekend. I drove my car to pick kids up and bring them to school. I was there early in the morning. I was there late at night. So I wasn't phoning it in. But what I was bringing was the desire, if I can be so callous as to characterize myself, is to fix the kids. And after a while, a series of, actually, there's 2 chapters that you'll be happy to know got cut out of this book about my New Haven experience. But there were several kids who finally said to me, I'm not ever going to listen to you anymore because of the way you're talking to me. And there was a point at which I started to realize that it wasn't my message, it was me. That I was telling kids they had to learn the periodic table and the placement of the comma and the dates of the Civil War and all these things, but I was telling them they had to become someone different than who they were. And I kind of had a religious experience, almost literally a religious experience. I moved into, I was living in the Dixwell Avenue neighborhood, if any of you know New Haven, which is right in the middle of the housing projects, and I was happy to be there, but I was really frustrated, and I could see that there was something wrong with the way I was trying to reach these young people. And someone gave me a book on centering prayer, it's called, and it was a journey into the Christian version of the contemplative tradition, the mystics of the Christian tradition, but in dialogue with Jewish mystics and with mystics from the Buddhist and Hindu tradition. And basically the whole book was about saying you've got to come to an interior space, and in that interior space you will discover who you are and that you don't have to change. One of the beautiful stories in the book, it was a story about a rabbi, we don't know the date, Rabbi Zuska is his name. And the student asked the rabbi, he's towards the end of his life, what have you learned? Gets different answers. And then he says, Rabbi, after you die, what do you think what do you think you will be asked? And the rabbi answers, he says, I know what I won't be asked. He says, I won't be asked why I wasn't like Abraham. And I won't be asked why I wasn't like Moses. He says, I might be asked why I wasn't Zuska. Why I never fulfilled the one unique purpose that I'd been given to fulfill. And I tell you, I read that, I was 25 years old. I mean, I can tell you where I was sitting when I read that. I put the book down, and I thought, my God, occurred to me. It just never occurred to me that my mission was to be me. I know it sounds pathetic, right? You're all thinking like, wow, you are really pathetic. But in retrospect, and the culture's changed too. These
powerful family you came from.
Yeah, it's the powerful family, but also I have to say, in fairness to me, the idea of self-discovery and interior life is much more common now, I think, than it was in the 70s and at this point in the early 80s. I think we were coming out of a phase where a lot of this kind of talk was much more unusual. And it made a huge difference to me. I all of a sudden thought to myself, that's the problem. I I'm looking at the kids, and I'm not trying to help them become what they're destined to become. I'm trying to shape them into something different. And so it shifted me completely. I became very interested in the mystics. I became interested in how you could actually teach mystical ideas in schools. So I hooked up with a lot of people doing things like social competence, which was a lot about stress management and silence and interiority, but it didn't use any religious language. We just used the language of psychology and of learning theory and of neuroscience, but it was the same thing. It was the same thing. It was like, wow, we can talk about the interior life and about self-discovery and about purpose and mission as an interior gift without having to worry about church and state, which of course is a big issue in the United States. So it set me off on trying to understand these things from the inside out. I guess that's the summary. And I think when you look and you understand that there's a way of seeing the world from the inside out, you start to slow down just enough to have the chance to see another human being, really see them, and not just see what they're wearing or see what the color of their skin is or what's on their business card or what's on their license plate or where their address is and those kinds of things.
And so then from there, you're in New Haven, you're teaching, you're thinking a lot about social learning and what to do and how to reach these kids. Then how do you get to the Special Olympics?
Well, actually, I was on the board. I was playing. I played on a unified team. Anybody play unified sports here? Right. So we have a lot of unified athletes. So I was on a unified softball team, and I was on the board of the local Special Olympics program in Connecticut. And Connecticut won the bid, actually against my wishes, even though I was on the board. We had a very eccentric state director called Peter Wheeler, who basically did, that some of you know him, basically did whatever he wanted as opposed to whatever the board wanted. And he bid for these games, and Connecticut won. And the games were literally, I lived a block from the Yale Bowl, and so they were going to be in my backyard. This person called and that person called, and I thought to myself, well, the last year of these games, I'll take a leave of absence from my job and go back in a year. But this is such a great opportunity to learn and to help put on this gigantic event in 130, 40 countries, and the President of the United States is going to come, and how can I pass it up? So I took a leave, and I met Loretta really as a friend and as a mentor, and between her and the experiences that she led me through, it was really a lot of it was Loretta. I realized that there was a classroom in Special Olympics too. It was just a different one, and that I could have a lot of fun working in it.
Now you mentioned this in the book that there is still work to do.
Yes.
The Special Olympics obviously have been a tremendous success. They have grown, as we said,
Right.
enormously in a very short period of time. There is a lot more acceptance for folks with intellectual disabilities than certainly at the time when the Supreme Court was ruling about compulsory sterilization. But we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
I think I do a lot of stories about special education and how kids are treated in the education system,
Right.
and sometimes
Please do more.
Sometimes it seems as if we've almost gotten very sophisticated in how to look as if we're adhering to the letter of the
Right.
law, but not actually meeting the needs of the kids.
Right.
And so I'd be interested to know what you think is the best way to go forward to help people with intellectual disabilities.
Well, it's a very good question. Again, there'd be 100 answers in this room. I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think, first of all, that there's two levels of this. First is the American context, and the next is the global context. The United States is a generous country. We care about the world. We think about our neighbors. We ought to think about our neighbors with intellectual disabilities. A child with Down syndrome born in South Africa is no different than a child with Down syndrome born in Boston. The treatment of people with intellectual and developmental differences around the world is horrific. I'm not embarrassed to say now. I'm embarrassed to say some of the other things I said, but that I'm reduced to tears frequently in my travels around the world. You just can't look at rows and rows of human beings in an institution sitting in chairs with their bodies slumped over and their eyes vacant. And, I can shake their hands and ask them their names, but I can see that the life has just been taken out of them. I mean, their bodies are still alive, but their spirits are just so broken, you know, just so broken by the culture. And it's terrifying, and it's extremely painful. So we ought to have a view. The State Department, our foreign policy, our engagement with the world ought to include. You know, we rightfully fought against apartheid in South Africa. We isolated that country. We gave aid to the political parties trying to advocate for change. The same is true, could be true of 100 countries. Not that we have to isolate them, but the idea, I mean, country after country, there are no special educators. I mean, none, no trained doctors. I don't mean like a few, I mean none. No schools. I mean, the education rate, primary schools, 90-some% of children with intellectual development don't go to school at all around the world. So, I mean, if this were any other population, it would be front page news. It would be a scandal. It would be outrage that we do business with countries that deliberately exclude children. If they did this, as they have done in parts to women and girls, you get really quite outraged. Rightfully outraged, but we don't do the same thing. So there's the international context. At home, I think the big challenges are in the adult. I mean, education has its challenges, don't get me wrong, but employment, transportation, adult medical care, these are areas, adult recreation, social structures, and so on. Most people with intellectual disabilities feel quite included in this culture until you get to about middle school. Some continue to have full lives into high school, and then there's this precipice against which people drop off. And 70, depending on how you count, 70, 80% unemployed. The denial of health care across a whole range of specializations is an epidemic. The absence of recreational or social opportunities is everywhere. So we have, you know, like you say, we've done the right thing by law, but in many cases we've sentenced people not to an institution, but to a lonely life with people all around. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on employment. We need to focus on the quality of health, and that includes fitness and nutrition and lifestyle issues, which we don't think of as issues for people with intellectual differences. But we have people who are more obese than the general population, higher rates of diabetes and heart disease, higher rates of smoking than the general population, higher rates of other things like seizure disorders and so on and so forth, higher rates of Alzheimer's disease in some conditions. So, you know, our population, higher rates of abuse at the hands of law enforcement. I mean, we're now in a period of time right today where the issues around law enforcement are front and center in the country, rightly so perhaps. But I don't want to say this in a comparative way, but a year and a half ago, a young man, 27 years old with Down syndrome, was killed by police in the state of Maryland, by law enforcement, I should say, because he wouldn't leave a movie theater. And there was no outcry. So now the good news is we've been working for a year and a half in the state of Maryland with law enforcement, and we'll make a lot of great changes to the training of the law enforcement. And law enforcement wants to know and learn. But there's a whole range of public policy initiatives that need to be done to accommodate the idea that a person with an intellectual difference can lead a full and meaningful life contributing to his or her community in a way that matters to everyone. We have not yet begun to turn the mechanisms of society to make that a reality.
Right, and you mentioned also how divisive our politics are, or certainly our political landscape
Yes.
is right now. I mean, is that, do you think, something that folks can look forward to in the near future with the political climate the way it is now?
Well, I think we can do things. I mean, in some ways it's a unifying population. I mean, but I do think we need leadership. I mean, we desperately need leadership. Right? I mean, we need people in politics who can ask the country, ask the state, ask the city to change. I mean, I closed this book with the quote, incident where President Kennedy's, you know, in a rally in 1962 talking about intellectual disability in the state of Ohio, and the litany at the end is, can you imagine? Can you imagine? So we need to be invited to imagine things differently. Can you imagine full employment? Can you? Can you imagine that every person at 22, 23, 24 years old with an intellectual disability, with autism, with a whole range of differences, can you imagine all of them having jobs? Can you? I mean, I'm asking, can you? Lisa, can you? Yes, say yes. I want to hear. I want to hear an answer. I want you to be alive, fully alive, not half dead. So we need to be invited to imagine and then come up with the solutions to do that. Is it possible? Good gracious, that's way above my pay grade. I can't, I don't know how we get out of the mess we're in.
You mentioned President Kennedy, so I'd like to ask you about two legacies.
Yeah.
Your mom and President Kennedy's. First, your mom, because you say in the book that you don't think, despite the success of the Special Olympics, that she ever felt that she was successful. Why?
She had a very high bar. She had a very high bar. And, you know, there was almost never a day when, I mean, I could come home and say, this is what happened today, and we got the government of China to sign this new pledge, and da-da-da-da, and this, that, and the other thing, and she'd be, how many people are there? 30, 40, maybe 50 million. How many people have you gotten so far into schools? Well, we had a good meeting. So she saw the injustice still, and it, you know, I have to say, it's almost, as I said before, it's almost like post-traumatic stress. The injustice just ground her down in terms of her anger, and so she was not beaten by the injustice, but she was never content. And so she would look at this room, and you know, she'd be 100% employment. Now you, all of you in this room, don't you wait for the mayor. And don't you wait for the senator. Senators aren't going to do anything. I'm telling you, I've known politicians my whole life. I know them. They're not going to do anything unless we demand it now. Can we do that today? Let's put together a team here. Okay, Lisa, come on. Let's Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Now, why not start right here? Special Olympics athletes, if they come into the movement, you should help them get the jobs. Like, Mommy, we're not in jobs. We don't do that. Well, you should. So she had a great sense of humor and a terrific resolve and a restless dissatisfaction, which I think all great change agents do. I don't think Mandela necessarily died content with the South Africa he left behind. I don't think Gandhi died content with the India he left behind. I don't think King died with the United States he left behind. If you see the world as they do, as great, and I don't, you know, put my mother in that category because I think she deserves it. If you see the world, the potential of the world to be different, and so dramatically different that you fight so hard because you've seen it. Somehow, you know, I think to myself, she was sailing one day with Rosemary on Hyannisport, probably in that boat that's on the yard behind us. And at some point she knew that the world could be different. And once you see that and you have enough fight and enough belief in yourself to pursue it, I think you never rest. So I mean, there's a lot of wonderful qualities she had, but rest, perspective, the chance to see the world with a long view, no, she never saw that. She saw it only in terms of the fight today, and she wanted to win.
Mm-hmm. And what about the legacy as we're sitting here in this memorial to President Kennedy?
Yeah.
What about his legacy that you think still endures today?
Well, I think obviously many, many things, but when it comes to this field, I mean, President Kennedy, I mean, in some ways, doesn't get enough credit, really. I mean, it's the first president to have a person with intellectual disability in the White House, first president to commission a national panel to study the issue, created the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, launched the research enterprise that would become university-affiliated programs, which even today endure as the one place in which research and clinical care and clinical supports are funded by the federal government, launched what would become the inclusive education movement, launched what would become the deinstitutionalization movement, And again, if the population on whose behalf he had done that were bigger, more powerful, and more wealthy, I think there would be monuments to that part of his legacy all over the world. But instead, we're small and we tend to be poor and we tend to fight like hell and be really busy. So we don't build monuments, we just keep fighting. So the legacy of the president in this regard, I think, is extraordinary. It really did create, and even today, I'll tell you, I get to sometimes meet heads of state in other countries when I can say what you could do for this country. I did this with the former president of Malawi just a few months ago. She unfortunately didn't win her re-election, but Joyce Banda was the president. I said, you know, Madam President, in the United States, things changed when the President of the United States brought a person with an intellectual disability into the house of the President, had their picture taken, and spoke on his behalf, and said that he was a valuable citizen. You too. And she did it. She said, I'll do that. I can do that. So, I mean, I take that picture of the President around the world and say that the work is here. I mean, on behalf of, you know, this is something a political leader can do. That, you know, on behalf of those, you got to remember, so many, I mean, there's moms and dads in this room, and there's self-advocates in this room. But the loneliness affecting people in developing countries, the mother who has a child who feels so alone in a Malawi, just to use that example, to see the president of the country on the cover of the newspaper holding a child like hers, shaking hands with a son or a daughter like hers. I mean, the amount of release, satisfaction, freedom that comes from feeling like someone cares. You know, someone can see. You know, I can be proud of my child. You know, I mean, isn't that what we all, I mean, those of us who have children, by the way, my daughter just arrived, even though she's a little late. I want you all to thank her for coming, Kathleen Shriver.
Welcome, welcome.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience before we run out of time. I think there's a microphone in the middle of the room. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? You can raise your hand. Anybody? No questions? No? Yes?
I'll be brief. I just have a question about, I love the Special Olympics. I'm a mom of a 24-year-old daughter with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. And for her, she's nonverbal. She's very happy with who she is, which is wonderful, and it teaches us a lot, you know, that she doesn't care that she's different. And we've sometimes struggled with schools wanting full inclusion for her, and she was included, but in a sub-separate classroom up until she was 18. She participated in Special Olympics, and she loved it when she went to a residential school at 18, and she was in a community of her peers.
Right.
People that were like her.
Right.
She was fully included in our family and in our community,
Sure.
but she knew she was in a community of her peers, you know, much like Special Olympics. And while there's such a push toward inclusion, and for some individuals that's absolutely the right thing, we have to fight for that right, but there's also the opportunity for others who want a different outcome. And I
That's a
just wonder
great
what your
question.
perspective is on that.
That's a great question.
Thank
Yeah, so my feeling is that any field, I mean, our field is really riven by this conflict over what's the right solution. And we get very combative. I mean, inside, nobody outside pays any attention, by the way, to us when we fight about sheltered workshops or group homes versus supervised apartments or, you know, inclusive classrooms or partially inclusive classrooms or fully, you know, I mean, nobody else cares. But we kill each other over it. I mean, we do. It's crazy. And the reason other people don't care is because they're coming and looking to us and saying, how can I help in the best sense? What can we do to be helpful? And when we say, you can't do this and you can't do that, but don't listen to her and don't listen to him, we lose people. My own feeling is, look, mature movements recognize that in social change, any afflicted population, any population that's been marginalized, will become ultimately respected, not as the members of the population, but as individuals. And when you're no longer African American, but you're just George, and you're no longer a person with intellectual disability, but you're just Susan, you may say, hey, I'm Susan, and I like to go to the the bridge club and do it, with all my women friends. And somebody, an ideologue would say, well, don't play bridge only with women. Have to play integrated bridge. It's ridiculous, right? So of course some people, and even in our movement, we're very big on unified sports. It's wonderful. But there's a lot of people who don't want to play on a unified team. They want to play on a team with other people who have kind of the similar, and their peer group is there, and everybody's relaxing and having a good time, and they frankly don't want me on their team, which is fine, as long as it's a choice. But the reason we get ideological is because we fear that it's not a choice, that the society is forcing models onto our people. So when we feel like a person has been forced into a special education program, forced into a sheltered workshop, forced into an institution, a group home, whatever it is, then people get worried that there's a subtle bias being built in and a discriminatory power that's playing out. So it's a long way of saying I am not an ideologue. A lot of people hate Special Olympics, or used to, not so much anymore, but they hate us as segregated and exclusionary and da, 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 da. I'm like, well, just watch people vote with their feet. We have a lot of people come who have intellectual disabilities, and they seem to enjoy it. And are you telling me that they shouldn't be happy? That they shouldn't be allowed to play and do these things and so on and so forth. So I think ultimately the success of the movement will come when we finally ask your daughter where she wants to be and respect her decision, as opposed to telling your daughter because she has X or Y or Z, she ought to be here.
But what do you... Just to follow up on that, while it may be a choice, I think it may be a difficult decision that some parents, have to make. And how do they make that choice exactly? What do you think is the best guidelines they should follow, really, in trying to make that kind of a decision? Is it where, trial and error, where a child may be happiest?
Well, I think parents are pretty good about it, actually. I think the problem is when you get into public policy, like should public policy invest in group homes or sheltered workshops or supervised employment or all these different models. And then you get to politicians who are saying, okay, we want to invest in the right one. Mm-hmm. And then you have one parent says, well, this is the right one, and the other parent says, that's the right one. And they actually not only say two different answers, but they say the other person's wrong. So it's not just that there's two different answers, it's that the two answers hate each other, or don't hate each other, but you know what I mean. So I think parents are pretty good at knowing their children and being able to gauge where their children are happiest. I mean, I don't ever want to be in a position of second-guessing a mom or a dad. Now, there are moms and dads who've struggled in raising their kids, like a lot of us have, and make bad decisions, but who hasn't? But when it comes to public policy, I think the bias toward inclusion is a good one. And I think the bias toward testing the limits of inclusive and normal, so to speak, normalized environments is the right bias to try. But I think the public policy ought to be flexible enough to allow people to make their own choices and support them in those choices.
I just have another question, sorry. When you spoke about your Aunt Rosemary, something that struck me in the book was that your family didn't want her to know almost that she was different, right? You called it a conspiracy of kindness, right?
Yeah.
Not letting her know. Was that a good thing?
When do you tell your kids the truth? You have to know, sometimes a 4-year-old doesn't need to, you can't tell a 4-year-old certain things, or a 12-year-old, or a 14-year-old, or a 20-year-old. Sometimes, sometimes she wants to know things that she's not ready to know yet. I think my grandparents wanted Rosemary not to feel isolated. They didn't want her to feel badly about herself, and so their strategy was to not tell her that she was different. Probably a good decision for a certain period of time, probably not such a good decision at an older age. Probably confusing to her in some ways and probably helpful to her in other ways. Was it the right decision? I mean, I don't think people would necessarily do it today that way. But I think in those days, especially with the fear of ridicule and humiliation. I think Rosemary Kennedy had probably as positive a life up until the time of the operation as anyone could have had with an intellectual disability in that era. And mind you, back to the issue of science and so on, and the ascendancy of experts who tell us where our children ought to be. It was the scientists who, not unlike in the Oliver Wendell Holmes decision, it was the scientists that recommended a lobotomy. It wasn't the nuns where she was working, the social workers where Rosemary was in schools, the tutors, the special educators, such as they were. They all tried to help Rosemary. The science, the Nobel Prize, was what recommended the fix. And I think that also, there are good scientists in this room, McGrader, doctors here who have given their lives to this population. So I don't want to paint too broad a brushstroke here. But we have to be wary of science when we're dealing with human difference, because science struggles to make sense of what the human heart sometimes understands about difference. So anyway, it's a long answer, but it's to say that I think they did the best they could, and I think that's all parents can do. Having 5 kids, that's a standard that's, I have to hope everybody gives to me. You do the best you can.
All right.
Other questions?
Any other
Comments?
questions?
I need a Special Olympics athlete to close this night out. We cannot finish this night
Okay.
without the voice, the authority. Okay, here we go. It didn't take much.
Yeah, sometimes, Jay, you know, Magnin. Used to say, well, I didn't have an Olympics team, so, you know, I was 2003 sitter.
Really? Whereabouts?
Ireland.
You went to Ireland? Nicely done. How did you do? How did you do? Were you at the opening ceremonies?
Yes.
Do you remember U2? Do you remember Bono?
Yeah, me too, yep.
Remember them coming on out?
Right.
All the dancers?
Oh, yeah.
You know what else happened at those opening ceremonies? I don't know if you noticed it there, but that was the first time we had a team from Afghanistan and a team from Iraq. And it was right at the beginning of the war. And even so, the guy who was helping to lead the games sent his private plane to Baghdad. A G4. Any of you know private planes? That's a nice private plane. That's a really nice private plane. Picked up the athletes from Baghdad and brought them to the opening ceremonies to be with you.
That's the day of 9/11 that year.
Yeah, nicely done. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Well, I'm Michael, and I have disabilities, and I have 2 best buddies.
Nice, congratulations.
Thanks. and all you have to do is believe, if I think I can, I can.
Oh.
Yeah. And I'm also trying to make new friends in school.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay, for your refrigerator magnets, if I think I can. Nice, we got it, we paid attention. Nicely done. You summarized a 275-page book in 1 sentence, so thank you. That's the cliff notes of my book, so if you get a test, they just say, if I think I can, I can.
One more question?
I could ask you a question. You want me to ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, what's your name?
My name is James Keith.
James?
Keith,
Keith. How old are you, James?
16,
16. And where do you go to school?
North Andover Public Schools.
And tell me about school. What's it like?
School's awesome because I listen to my music a lot, and I dance, and people like love to see me dance.
Okay, now you know what we're gonna see. Come on, man, come on up. Do you need music to dance? Do you need music to dance, or can you just dance in your own space?
Yeah, I can dance in my music and dance in my own space.
Like if you don't have music, can you dance?
Yes.
That's just like my daughter. So if I ask her to come up here right now, will you dance with her?
Sure.
Okay. Come on, Kathleen. Now, we must have, do we have a singer? Be honest now, does anybody here sing? I know there's, just a second, come on up. Can you sing? DeMaurier is here. He's come all the way from Washington just to see, just for this occasion. Now,
And he can sing?
he can sing.
All
Oh, yes,
right.
he can. He can sing. Right over, no, you have to come up here, and they're going to dance.
I'm not going to sing, we'll give you a beat.
You're going to give a beat, okay. All right, well, come on up. All right, here we go. Come on, James, let's go. Come on. Oh. Oh! Come on up! Come on up! Bravo! That is fully alive. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you.